We won't go in one direction
or zig where we can zag.
We will walk through walls.
We will take a look around us.
We will not be confined.
We believe in the path of least limits.
We won't be told how to view the world.
We will experience true freedom.
We will not compromise.
We will live the game through our hands.
We will be in control of something.
We will change the system.
Hey guys, it's Rick with The Digital Divide. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Nintendo 64. This is a console that I got the Christmas of 1996. It released in Japan on June 23rd, 96, and in North America on September the 26th, 1996. This is a console that initially I fell completely in love with, but also fizzled out real quick. And I'll explain why later on in the video. This is going to be a shorter retrospective as a result. Nintendo ultimately went on to sell about just under 33 million units across the world. Originally, the Nintendo 64 started life as the Ultra 64, and Nintendo was planning to make this just a very simple black and gray themed console to appeal more to adults, and they wanted to initially move away from the more colorful, childlike aesthetic of their previous consoles. They ultimately ended up scrapping that idea and sticking with the original, the more Nintendo-themed, colorful buttons on the controller there. This controller, by the way, pretty much standardized analog controls. It was one of the first to come right out of the box with it. When PlayStation originally launched, it did not have an analog stick, and then later added them. Now, when the Nintendo 64 launched, it launched with a whopping 2 games. That's right, 2 games in the United States total. If you compare that to every other console that they've ever pushed, which you can see here, their launch lineup was a little bit anemic. And a lack of third-party support was one of the biggest issues with the Nintendo 64. A lot of that had to do with the fact that Nintendo chose to stick with the cartridge format when developing the Nintendo 64. At the time, optical CDs were taking over the gaming space, and for good reason. They were very, very cheap to manufacture, and they also had way more storage available on them. PlayStation CDs, for example, topped out at about 660 megabytes, while the Nintendo 64's maximum cartridge size was only 64 megabytes, making the difference in storage capacity pretty severe, particularly when you keep in mind that few games shipped on cartridges that large. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, for example, was one of the bigger games on the system, and that shipped on a 32 megabyte cartridge. Cartridge-based games were also just much more expensive and difficult to manufacture than their optical counterparts. PlayStation CD-ROMs reportedly cost about $1 to $2 to manufacture, while cartridges for the Nintendo 64 were more than $30 a pop. And because Nintendo gets a royalty off of each cartridge sold, this probably explains why they didn't abandon the format. Unfortunately for them, though, this meant that developers made very little money off of games sold on their platform. This caused most to shift development over to the PlayStation or PC platform, including Squaresoft. And Squaresoft used to be one of the biggest Nintendo supporters back in the Super Nintendo days. In the 8-bit NES days, they published almost all of their Final Fantasy games exclusively on Nintendo platforms, but Square Enix wanted to utilize the additional space that a disc would provide in order to create long, elaborate CG videos for their games. So they ended up moving over to PlayStation and shifted development of Final Fantasy VII over to Sony's platform. This would go on to become a massive hit for them on the PlayStation and a devastating blow for the Nintendo 64. The Nintendo 64 features a 93.75 MHz NEC Power VR 4300 series CPU, 4 megabits of RAM, which is expandable up to 8 megabits with the expansion pack. Graphics are an SGI chip running at 62.5 megahertz. It's a 64-bit chip. This was the reality chip that they pushed so hard, and it actually has 2 sub-processors as well. It really can't push that much polygon-wise. I think it's 100,000 per second with full quality on, which is not that much. And this goes back to one of the various reasons why I fell off of the Nintendo 64 to begin with. The first was a lack of third-party support, as I touched on earlier, but the second is that the Nintendo 64 was notorious for having extremely blurry visuals. It has to do with the way that Nintendo's hardware adds a horizontal blur feature that softens the image so that it looks decent on an old CRT TV, but it's to a fault, to the point where it looks like somebody smeared Vaseline on your screen. They've actually come out with hardware recently to get rid of this. It's the way that the Nintendo 64 handles anti-aliasing, and it's too much. It literally hurts my eyes if I play games on this thing for too long. Another issue that they have is that they basically, the frame rates on a lot of the games are horrendous, specifically Jet Force Gemini, which you can see a clip that Digital Foundry did a video on. You can see this clip here. Just go over there and give them a click to watch the whole thing. But Jet Force Gemini and GoldenEye specifically were notorious for dipping down, sometimes to the single digits when it comes to the frame rate, which makes the game, in my opinion, unplayable. Now, I mentioned that Nintendo 64 only launched with 2 games, but that was quickly followed up by some others, and those were Pilot Wing 64, Mortal Kombat Trilogy, Wave Race 64, Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey, Killer Instinct Gold, Cruisin' USA, and Star Wars Shadow of the Empire. While we're on the topic of games, I'm going to go over some highlights, I think. These are must-plays for the Nintendo 64, in my opinion, and these were my favorites. Okay, guys, these are just some quick picks. Obviously, there's a lot more on the system that's worth playing. These are just 5 that I could think of off the top of my head in no particular order. So, number 1 is obviously Super Mario 64. This is one of the best games of all time. I mentioned earlier that the Nintendo 64 only launched with 2 games initially, but they were lucky that one of them happened to be one of the best games ever made, so that got them through their initial launch. Fantastic game. I'm sure you've all played it, so there's not much more to say about that, but it stands the test of time, and it basically standardized the way that 3D open world games work. Number 2 on the list is going to be Conker's Bad Fur Day. This is a very mature R-rated game that came out later in the Nintendo 64's life cycle, and you start off at a bar hungover, so that kind of sets the mood for you. There's a lot of cursing in it. It's just, I thought it was hilarious. Graphics were also super impressive for the Nintendo 64, although the frame rate wasn't great. Number 3 is Wave Race 64. This game blew me away when I first saw it because it was the first game that did water physics realistically. Even today, I think it holds up pretty well. I can still pop this in and play it and have a blast doing so. It is one of the best games on the system, in my opinion. At number 4, we have Turok the Dinosaur Hunter. This game kind of showcased what the Nintendo 64 could do as far as first-person shooters were concerned, although there is a lot of fog in the game. The sequels kind of resolve that issue, but overall I think the series is terrific and it's well worth a play. They actually just re-released this on the Nintendo Switch, and I think it's on PC as well. Okay, the next on the list, number 5, is going to be Ogre Battle 64. I love this game. It is a big RPG. It's a strategy, tactical game. I just think it's terrific. It might actually be my favorite game on the Nintendo 64, aside from Mario 64. A lot of people don't know about this game, and fewer have played it, but it's well worth it if you can find it. It is pretty expensive to get a cartridge on eBay, but well worth it if you can find it. Okay, guys, last on the list is going to be Star Fox 64. If anyone knows me, they know that I love the Sega Saturn, and this is basically Panzer's Dragoon for the Nintendo 64. Terrific game. It's on rails, but there are some points in the game where you can branch off, so you do have some choice. Overall, I thought it's a terrific game, although it is on the short side, though. You can probably beat this in like an hour and a half. But it's replayable because there are some branching paths to take you to new planets. Well worth it, and pretty cheap on eBay. Alright, guys, that's going to do it for me. Thank you for watching, and I appreciate you. Bye.